We start the second part of our three-part of cadence of life in the fast track. So we heard a lot of exciting things in the first part. So I'm quite curious to know what's happening in the second part. Go ahead, Mike, let's hear you.
Okay, here we go. We're going to go back to life in the fast lane. Again, it's not about a decadent lifestyle. It's about the environment that we're operating in today in business. Okay, so we talked about in the first part, again, the speed that technology is evolving. It's an exponential function. We've got people absorbing technology, absorbing change, changing their organization. That's logarithmic, which is much slower than the technology is evolving, and it's leaving a gap. Okay, so they aren't going at the same speed, and they're actually, one is pulling away from the other one at an increasing rate. So that gap is not a constant size, or it's an increasing rate. Okay, an increasing gap. So, and that gap represents risk and it represents opportunity. So that means we got to manage this gap. Okay. So the first thing we want to recognize is, again, that technology is an independent variable. It's going to go at its own speed. We don't have control of it. It's people doing what people do. They innovate. And as they innovate, the technology evolves. Now they've got tools in their hands where they can use technology to innovate technology, and it's just going faster and faster and faster. There doesn't appear to be any real stopping point to it at this point. We went through, we went through that thing at one point where people were inventing things early 1900s, and somebody came out and said everything that could be invented has been invented. And, we're now we're in exactly the antithesis of that, where we're looking at this going, we don't have any idea how much stuff is going to be invented, but it's coming, and it's coming fast. Then we look at the organizations and we say, all that change, more and more stress. People are in a tougher and tougher time dealing with it. Organizations are having more difficult time dealing with it, and we're only moving at this logarithmic speed, and that gap is getting bigger. Okay, so that kind of changes what really should be being done by management. Like I say, there's organizations that get enamored with technology. Okay, certainly the computer industry does, because it's evolving so quickly, moving so quickly. The software is moving, the hardware is moving, the firmware is moving, everything's moving, right? And so they spend all their time, or a lot of their time, on the technology. Okay, people are not going that fast. So you get them in looking at both of these things, and realistically, what they need to be paying attention to is that gap. Okay, the distance between the technology and the organization speed, because that gap represents a risk to the company. If you don't take care of the technology, or if you don't use the technology as being in that market, you're basically putting a welcome mat out for new competitors. So, you've got to manage that. So, probably one of the best examples is that, and again, I was at Compaq in the 90s, the early 90s. What would happen is they would come out with a new processor. And one of Compaq's strategies is they would go to that processor manufacturer, and they would commit to buy 100% of the first year's production. Whether they've used it or not, okay, they'd say, okay, we're going to buy it all. That kept it out of the hands of everybody else. That gave them a year's head start on everybody else. Okay.
What I'm saying is that they kill the first product, is it?
I'm sorry?
Do they kill the first product then?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we used to have some of the most amazing meetings between marketing. One of Compact's strengths, okay, was between marketing and engineering. It was an amazing relationship. They worked so well together. And I was part of the third division. And I remember walking into a meeting, and these were big meetings. You know, you got all your top engineers, you got all your top marketing people. And the marketing people had just an amazing amount of data. And I remember this vice president walking in, and he said, okay, he goes, that's it, guys. He goes, every 486 product that we're building, he goes, those projects are all shut down, which was almost everybody in the room. He goes, everything's going to Pentium. We need plans for new Pentium products. And just that quick, we went from 486s to Pentiums. And there was no time to think, no time to respond. I mean, it was just like, okay, that's gone. It's off the plate. We're not going to think about it anymore. You know, we're going to change everything to Pentiums. And that was how they managed that gap. We've already bought all these. We're going to use them. We're not making the old product anymore. And this is how we're going to keep people out of that gap. So by the time the technology becomes available to the other people, we've already got a year's worth of experience with it.
Mm.
And I mean, it was a very amazing time to be at Compact and be in that, have access to the engineering and marketing interaction. Because you were seeing people leveraging technology to own the market, and you don't always get a good look at that. So that's how people need to be looking at it, or how they should be looking at it. They should be looking at that gap, realizing what are opportunities in that gap, what are risks in that gap. You hear people talk about SWOT analysis, which is not an analysis by any means at all. I mean, it's a way to organize opinions. But it's important that you almost want to do that kind of SWOT analysis in the gap to get you started in there. So the gap, so it's of huge strategic importance. It's much more critical to your strategy than the curves are. Again, the technology curve is going to do what it's going to do. You can pay attention to it all day long. And you might be able to step in and help make it faster, if you add research to it, but you can't stop it. You can't slow it down. You can't stop it. And again, you can do something in terms of your ability to absorb change, but you're not going to catch up with technology. So this gap, you've got technology sitting in there. You've got technology that's iterations of what you already do. You've got brand new technology. There's all kinds of opportunities in there. And like I say, the biggest problem with that gap is if you don't use it and you don't address it and you don't manage it, you're creating an entry point for a new competitor. Okay, so if somebody sits back, sir?
Yes, sir. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, if you looked at it, that's exactly what Dell did in the computer business, right? They watched it, Compaq was really coming in and leading the charge. And all of a sudden, Dell rolled in with a whole different model. And it really wasn't a computer technology model. It was a manufacturing model and a marketing model. And he rolled in and he flipped the market. Okay, all of a sudden, Compaq went from owning the market to Dell was a huge competitor. And then they came in with their laptop, and then everything really got turned upside down. So that's what can happen to you very quickly if you aren't paying attention to what's going on in that gap. Okay, so now, we go into this thing that's a little less scientific.
But it is more realistic as it is the technology part. This is interesting. It's getting more interesting, Mike.
Yeah, because when you talk about Moore's law and you talk about Martek's law, you're kind of in this esoteric world, right? And you're looking at it and you understand that it's creating this environment. Okay, when we start to introduce disruption, this is something people do on purpose. Okay, so again, let's start with definitions so that basically you have an understanding of the context I'm using the words. So just a generic definition, disruption, okay, is just a disturbance. You're interrupting an event, an activity, or a process. Now we get into the business definition. It's a little less benign, okay? it's radical change, okay? So it's not just disturbance. I mean, we're talking about radical change to an existing industry or a market, okay? And it's basically driven by technological innovation. And not when you think about technological innovation, it's not technology in terms of like creating a Pentium from a 486. I mean, just look at innovation in marketing, okay? With Steve Jobs in his 1984 commercial, I mean, he changed video advertising in a Super Bowl ad, and so, I mean, he changed that technology of just a marketing side of it. So, it's technology in a lot of different aspects, but it's radical change. Okay. So nobody sees it coming. Somebody does something, and all of a sudden you wake up the next day and you're in a different world.
So, Mike, sorry to interrupt you there.
No.
I know that is disruption, what I did right now, but disruption is not a negative word. It is right now, it was not meant to be disrespecting you, but it is intentional, as you said it over here. It is a deliberate intervention that is done to disrupt so that there is something new that comes out of it. It is deliberately done, right? In as much as I did to use with no disrespect meant.
Yeah. No, and we'll see in a minute. There's different types of disruption.
Okay.
But in terms of our interaction, yeah, it's welcome. It's a welcome disruption because I have a tendency to talk faster and faster and faster, and so you get me to stay in touch with my audience here. But so it's a very good disruption. But yeah, this became a business strategy, and it became like the newest, sexiest thing for people to do. And so now people are all enamored with the idea of disruption. And so they do it on purpose. Sometimes they do it to create a hole in a market that it doesn't necessarily appear to have an entry point. Sometimes they do it just because they can. And there's not really any deviousness behind it. They just get an idea, they take advantage of the idea, and all of a sudden got, disruption sitting in the middle of your market or of your business. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons people get into this. Let's talk a little bit about what types there are, and maybe that'll become a little clearer. Because normally what people think about when they start talking about disruption is they're thinking about destructive disruption. Okay, people roll into a market and they do something and they want to just destroy what's there and replace it with what they're bringing to the market. And probably the most current version of that is Blockbuster had this huge network all over the United States, where you could go rent movies and people would spend hours walking up and down aisles looking at, at different movies that were on VHS tape and stuff like that. And all of a sudden, Netflix rolled in, and I didn't have to go to a store anymore. Entirely new model. And in a very short period of time, Blockbuster was pretty well gone. And so that was a destructive, and I'm not saying Netflix came with the idea that said, okay, we're going to destroy Blockbuster. They came in and said, we got this technology, we're going to change the model. And the consequence of it was destructive disruption to the people that ran Blockbuster. And it was Blockbuster not paying attention to what was going on in the gap. Okay. Self-disruption is even more interesting. It's where a company disrupts itself. Okay. And I think you kind of have to have a different kind of mindset to do this. Maybe an Elon Musk kind of mind, but certainly a Steve Jobs kind of mind. I mean, you look at Jobs, he rolled in, he was making a lot of money off of iPods. Everybody was excited. It was just an amazing thing to have, and you travel as much as I do. Having an iPod on an airplane is fantastic. Okay. You don't have to be involved with all the noise that's going on around you. You can listen to what you want to listen to. But what he did was he had this great product, an iPod, and then he put it inside of an iPhone, or he put the technology inside of an iPhone, and he killed his iPods. So he self-disrupted himself, but, of course, the iPhone has paid off very well. Accidental disruption. This is where somebody just kind of wandering around and they find something and somebody goes, I got a really good idea what to do with that. And probably the number one thing was example that you hear used repeatedly over that is 3M Post-it notes. The adhesive that's on the Post-it note, by all standards, probably wasn't up to 3M standard, but somebody found a reason to use it. And now there's Post-it notes everywhere. I probably got 7 or 8 of them sitting right here in front of me right now. But they're built into processes. You see a procedure for doing, a value stream map. Yeah. And that procedure has Post-it notes on it, and brainstorming uses Post-it notes. And so they're everywhere. And it was purely accidental. Now you've got intentional. Sometimes this is strategic. But, this one is probably one of the ones that probably really threw disruption into the public eye. You look at Linus Torvalds, he sat up in his mother's apartment, or that's what the story is. I got no way of knowing if that's true or not. But sat in his mother's apartment writing an operating system, created the Linux kernel, and then he did the one thing that nobody even conceived of. I'm sure somebody thought, well, somebody else is out there working on another operating system, because Microsoft really owned that market. Nobody ever pictured that somebody would not only write an operating system, but then they gave it away for free on the internet. And that just floored the world, right? And so, here's this kid that, not a kid anymore, but at the time, they said he ran around, in free t-shirts that he got at computer conferences, and sandals, and came out of nowhere and totally disrupted Microsoft when there were major competitors of Microsoft that hadn't been able to execute that. Okay, and then their last type of disruption is defensive. Okay, and if you've ever seen the movie Pirates of Silicon Valley, yes. It's really the story of Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. and the things that they do in the early days of innovating computers, and they're really disrupting each other, and so it's a lot of intentional and defensive disruption that goes on between the two, which makes for actually a very good story. So, we've got this idea in our head that disruption is destructive, but realistically, it can be a lot of different things. So when I go back and I pick up the idea that says, okay, I've got this gap I'm trying to manage, I've created this entry point, plus there's this other entry point that I've got to keep an eye on, called disruption. Okay. And can I incorporate disruption some way to help me manage the gap? And so it becomes part of that, developing that strategy of how am I going to deal with that gap? Okay, so this is the slide.
Wow.
Okay. And I made a change to this slide, but we basically have to look at this. We have two different types of innovation. Okay, I have sustaining innovation. Now, if I talk about sustaining innovation, this is where current users have the advantage. Okay, so when I look at that, two markets that really stand out: the automotive market, and the other one is computers, right? But of course, you look at that and say, okay, anybody that's building a car, okay, it's capital intensive. It takes a lot of data. It takes a lot of engineering. It takes things like that. So obviously, if I'm going to innovate in the automotive market, I've got an advantage if I'm already currently in that. So the current users have the advantage in that. But then you've got disruptive innovation, okay? New players, okay, have the advantage because they're not dealing with the legacy of the current users. And I mean, you look at that right now in Tesla, okay? I mean, everybody's got the electronic vehicle, and I mean, even the Japanese companies, who have, created things in the automotive industry very well. General Motors, Ford, everybody's trying to develop this electronic vehicle. Here comes Elon Musk and Tesla out of nowhere, and all of a sudden they're leading the electronic vehicle market. But they're new players. They got new technology. I mean, Musk obviously has absolutely no fear of technology. So I mean, you look at what he's done with space exploration. You look at, or at least getting into it, what he's done with electronic vehicles. And I'll be honest with you, when he started, with Tesla, I sat back and looked at it and said, he doesn't have the background to really be in the electronic vehicle market. And I mean, how completely wrong I could be. I mean, I'd been in the automotive market for years, and I mean, I was, just wasn't aware, of the technology, and the absolute ability of some people, or at least underestimated it. But going back to the other example that we started in the previous slide, okay, we were walking around for a while with this thing called a Sony Walkman. And I don't know, there's probably a huge amount of our audience that doesn't even know what a Walkman was, or they weren't alive when they were used. I mean, you had to have, cassette tapes with them, and, this thing was big and it was bulky, and so again, you couldn't just flip from one song to another. You had to go and order the tape and all that other stuff. And so, but that was kind of what was the current technology. And it had evolved, okay? So it's basically the blue line in the graph that we're looking at down there. And then all of a sudden, Jobs shows up and says, I got an iPod, okay? And you look at it, and the iPod was kind of a miracle in a couple different ways. Okay, it basically shut down the Walkman. Now all of a sudden, I can pick my song. I've got a smaller device. I've got more control over the technology. I've got better sound. Okay, so now I've got this new piece of technology. So it says now that the advantage switches to the new players. Okay, so now it's gone from Sony, who owned the market. Now all of a sudden, Apple owns the market. Okay, and then again, like we said earlier, okay, Apple moves it back into the sustaining thing that says, all right, I own this little iPod. And I mean, one of the other miracles with the iPod, I mean, the iPod was basically an MP3 player. So why did the iPod win out over all the other versions of MP3 players? And that's marketing. That's innovation in marketing. Or that's my opinion why they were so much better at selling iPods than most people were at selling MP3s. But then you've got Jobs, who takes his very successful iPod, sticks it in his iPhone. Okay, now all of a sudden everybody's carrying an iPhone. Now all of a sudden they're carrying an iPhone and an iPod, and he kills his own product, kills his own successful product. So I mean, that's how fast this technology thing is flipping around, and it's really completely uncontrolled. I mean, it's whatever the mind can conceive. And if you get these very active, very creative people, things can just absolutely go completely out of control. And as a society, as a global economy, we're the beneficiaries of that being out of that control. So again, the thing is to remember that you've got sustaining innovation, okay, and the guys that have the advantage there are the current users. You've got disruptive innovation. Your new players have the advantage there, and that tends to be new technology.
I just want, as you're saying this, what thought occurred to me is that they have never lost focus of their target customers, right? Of getting it more, specifically in this example, how do I make it less bulky, more flexible, etc. So they always had that customer in mind. It was not only technology. Am I right?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, think about this. I mean, the phone, right? I had this phone in the 90s when I first started consulting. I had the Motorola Brick. Okay, you realistically could not put that in your pocket. This thing was huge. It was heavy. I think there's still two of them in my garage somewhere. Okay. And nobody ever used it. I mean, if your cell phone started to ring, you had to answer it because nobody called you on it, right? It was expensive. And so they kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And I mean, you had these little flip phones, and, they were very small, and you could maybe text on them, and you could do phone calls on them and things like that. And so it got smaller and smaller and smaller, and everybody was looking for this very small, very compact, very usable thing. And then all of a sudden, you stuck iPods in them, you stuck cameras in them. I mean, if I would have taken the original phone and made it bigger, okay, nobody would have ever gone that direction. Making it smaller, it became more popular. Then as you added things to it, like the iPod, like the cameras and things like that, all of a sudden people accepted it being bigger. I remember the first time I saw my IT guy with a big phone, I thought, I'm never having one of those. I don't want something that big in my pocket. Okay, now all of a sudden you've got more features in it. Now there's a reason for you to put it in your pocket, right? I can take a picture anytime I want. I can take a video anytime I want. I can text. I can direct message. I can access the internet. I mean, I sit and watch I mean, I watch my son texting, and I mean, he'll sit and text without looking at the keyboard. He's just got his thumb moving around, and he doesn't even have to check. It checks the spelling, and it does everything. And I mean, the technology's just gotten to that point. And so now we've gone to a completely different thing, which makes you kind of curious. Are we going to continue to go bigger, or are we going to go smaller? How do I get the same amount of technology in a smaller device? Or does anybody even care? And it's just this wild ride that everybody's on, which is actually kind of exciting. I mean,
Yep.
it makes it more difficult for people to manage organizations, companies. But as long as you build a company that's creative and innovative, you shouldn't have any fear. There's no reason to fear it. So it's exciting times.
Yep.
All right. So we got disruptive innovation. Again, this is where all the action is happening. That fast lane, life in the fast lane, that fast lane is in the gap. Okay. So the advantage goes to the new entrants. Okay. They target the gap. They look at the technology that's not being used. They're probably more aware of technology that's in development. I'll guarantee you that, there's levels of knowledge, right? And I mean, I get most of my information off of the internet. By the time it's on the internet, there's nothing special about the internet or the information I'm working with. But if you're Elon Musk or you're Bill Gates, the information that you have access to is not only what is in the gap, it's what's being developed in the gap. So they can make strategic decisions, right? I mean, huge amount of work on innovating batteries, for these electronic vehicles or batteries for anything. That's got to be a huge amount of where you can with new products that you're developing. So again, by not managing that gap, not being aware of that gap, you're putting a welcome mat out for brand new competitors. And if it's sustaining type innovation, you're opening the door. If you're not taking advantage of it, you're opening the door for your current competitors to, take away market share from you. Okay, now we start to talk about the other thing, dystopia. Okay.
Let me get that right. Dystopia.
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 It is the antithesis. It is the antithesis of utopia.
Okay, dystopia.
Now, we've got to look at this, and again, I hate to go back to the same thing, but again, just to set the groundwork here.
Yep.
If I look at the generic definition of it, and I mean, it's amazing how far back this goes. Okay, but some say it goes back into the 1700s. Okay, but it's an imagined world or a society which leads to wretched, dehumanized, fearful lives. Okay, so it's basically a complete upheaval of everything of life as we know it. Okay, and so we look at a dystopian society, and it's a hypothetical or imaginary society that's usually in science fiction or fantasy type literature, and of course nowadays it's in all kinds of video games as well. So that's really the context we're going to use dystopia in.
Yep.
But where it really came to the forefront, in 1938, Orson Welles did a thing called War of the Worlds on radio. And it was made to sound like all of a sudden we had an invasion, it was creating this dystopian society. And it was so real that people were like committing suicide, or at least the history says they committed suicide. And for some reason, that caught everybody's attention. And of course, Hollywood became enamored with it. And they absorbed that. And since then, they've done all kinds of things with it. And we see it in terms of Mad Max, and Thunderdome and Terminator and Matrix for sure. I mean, that really has gone over in the Hunger Games. So I mean, they did the typical Hollywood packaging of something that's actually not something that people really want to experience, but they find it intriguing. Okay. So you see these movies and these ideas, the movies, the books, the video games around dystopia have all done really well. Okay. So we're rolling around, we've got this whole attitude about it. We think it's cool. And then all of a sudden we hit 2020. Okay, 2020 was not really dystopia in terms of the context that we agreed we were going to use it, but it gave us a peek behind the curtain. Okay. We saw the entire world turned upside down by a pandemic. And without it actually becoming a totally dystopian society where, buildings are falling down and, all kinds of things, governments are collapsing and everything like that. Without getting that far into it, we were probably into this thing maybe 4 to 5 months before people starting going, I just want to go back to my normal life.
Yeah.
Okay. So all of a sudden that idea of being enamored with the dystopia started to fade away pretty quick. But some of the things that came out of this, because it's actually gone on for 2 years, it didn't go away. People found out you couldn't go away just by wishing that it would go away. And if we remember going back to the book Future Shock, one of the things Toff started talking about was the focus was going to switch from people going to work to an office or a factory, and the focus would move back to the home. And we've seen a lot of that. Okay. I mean, we're dealing with this, what they call the resignation generation. For some reason we have to have names for everything. But a lot of the focus out of that whole move of people resigning and people looking for different jobs is flexibility. They want to work from home. I don't know about you, but I've been working from home for 25 years. It's a huge advantage to me to not have to get up and waste an hour, or like when I was in Chicago, it was an hour and a half drive into work every day, an hour and a half drive home every day. So 3 hours of my day were spent sitting in a car driving to and from work. Okay, I don't have to do that anymore. I can come out, I can turn on my computer, I can make coffee. By the time everything's booted up and everybody's running, I got a cup of coffee and I'm ready to sit down and go to work. And maybe I've shaved and maybe I haven't, but nobody cares, unless I have a conference call. So, it's a whole different lifestyle. So dystopia, as we had portrayed it, okay, and become enamored with it, a lot of the shine has come off of it. So it's not quite as attractive as we thought it would be, but it's still there. Okay. I mean, like I said, we have seen what, it's done to the supply chain. We've seen it do what it's done to industries. We've seen what it's just done to people's lives. Like we were talking about, it completely changed the way that we were training our children. Okay. They were going to school using the internet. okay, which may or may not be a good idea, but it certainly wasn't a good idea to use it in the way in which we used it. So again, we're not real sure we want to go down that dystopia path right away. So when you look at dystopia, it's more of a threat, not a strategy. Mostly because if it's a strategy, you can't decide to use it and then control it.
Yeah.
I mean, once that pandemic started, we spent 2 years trying to figure out how to get it under control, or at least some semblance of control. So do you want to really do something like that as part of a strategy? Probably not. Okay. But you need to be aware of those things that are out there that can create that, because it's certainly a threat to your business. And I mean, if we look at it, as we got into the COVID pandemic, people are going, well, it happens every 100 years. That is pure nonsense. I have no idea why people got that idea in their head. Okay. Maybe they think they can remember that. Well, they can't remember the Spanish pandemic. Okay. But that was 100 years ago. If you go look at the actual data, okay, since the year 2000, in the new millennium, we've had more than 70 epidemics and pandemics globally. And then I know people can say, well, the world doesn't, everything happens in the world doesn't affect me. It does. Okay. Even if you only do business locally, it's a global economy like we discussed. Yep. So things that affect the global economy are going to affect you. Pandemics, it doesn't matter if it happens in, I don't know, pick a country, Thailand, Vietnam, Lithuania. It doesn't matter where it is, okay? Somehow that is going to touch either you or your supply chain or something. So you got to pay attention to it. And so to take such a simplistic look of things that says, well, it only happens every 100 years, lets you walk right into what we walked into. Okay. And so what that's done for us is those people that have finally woke up and realized that there was a huge forewarning to this, and realized that the reason we got hit the way we hit was we don't do risk management very well. We don't do it very well at all. I mean, if you look at the number of pandemics and epidemics that we've had since the year 2000, it's on the average, we're seeing something new every 3.5 months. We didn't see it coming on something that happens every 3.5 months on average. Okay, that means something's not working very well. And the thing that's supposed to detect that is risk management. We don't do it. And you've got to get better at it because, again, remember what we're trying to do is we're trying to manage that gap. Dystopia, disruption, it's part of that gap. You've got to be able to understand that. You've got to be able to have a grasp of it and be able to understand what you've got to do to deal with it when you're trying to operate in that gap, and how well you manage that gap is your survival as an organization. Okay.
Sorry, Mike, reflecting on what you said right now in this, is that in any case, this risk is happening or would happen, etc. It is your ability to gauge it much before it happens and take appropriate action to reduce, eliminate whatever is the risk factor. Am I getting it right? That in any way something is going to happen and you are able to predict it and take countermeasures, etc., preventive measures. Am I somewhere close to what you're saying?
But yeah, and I think it's actually probably even more than that. But yeah, that certainly is where it starts, right? You look at what's going on in the gap, okay? And so you're looking at it, and there's things in there that either represent risk or they represent opportunity.
Mm.
And so, you look at a company and you say, okay, what are my core competencies? Okay, because my core competencies are things that I can iterate, and that iteration, because I'm iterating, I've got the advantage in that market. Okay, but if I just continue to iterate and ignore new technology, I'm opening the door to new competitors. Okay, so I not only want to set as a strategy the thing that says, how can I iterate? So I've got the advantage. I want to make a decision. I want to be able to sit and say, okay, look, here comes this technology. I want that piece of technology. I can do something with that. I'm going to ignore that technology because I don't see it as a big risk. And then all that has to operate inside the world that we operate inside of. So, what we saw with the pandemic, you can pay attention to your business, you can pay attention to technology and things like that. But if you ignore the environment that you're operating in, um, and that's a really wide use of the word environment, okay?
So,
And, and
sorry for
still get yeah, I'm sorry.
sorry for this. So, gone are the days where we could have strategy for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and we can just relax. The days are now within probably, I do not know what would be the period, maybe nanoseconds of, I don't know what it is, that you have to keep your eyes focused on the gap and keep the strategies moving in a dynamic manner, that you don't lose sight of the threat or the opportunities. Gone are the days of where you can have 5 years plan, 10 years plan. Those days are gone. It is now in probably nanoseconds. I don't know whether I'm exaggerating it.
Yeah, I mean, if you're in the right industry, it probably could be. I mean, you hear about nanotechnology all the time, but yeah, you're right. I mean, the days of 5-year plans. I mean, they were never very good to begin with, right? And I mean, 10-year plans were even more worthless. Uh, but when in the days I worked at Motorola, and I got out of there in the early '90s. Even a 3-year plan had become kind of iffy. You didn't want to bank on it. You didn't want to put a lot of money into something that you thought was going to be, the real thing 3 years out. Again, depending on your technology. Automotive, you were still okay with 3 years out because it took them that long to develop a new car. But, if you were supplying, parts, like when we were making, I also had a factory where we were making sensors. That's dynamic. Oh my God. I mean, you're looking at that, and I mean, we're sputtering metal on glass, anodically bonding silicon and glass together. I mean, I sat in a conference and I've got a factory where I'm anodically bonding silicon and glass to each other, listening to a professor explain why you can't anodically bond silicon and glass, and you're sitting there going, I'm doing it every day. Okay, but you know, that's that thing, that says this thing is moving, and you've got to be aware of everything that's going on. And there's stuff that you can control and there's stuff that you can't control. And so like when you're dealing with things like pandemics, yeah, you've got to be able to uh, deal with, at least be aware of it and say, okay, if this thing breaks out, if this kind of thing breaks out, what do we do? And I mean, I was very lucky. Uh, in December of November into December of 2019, I got asked to go to Vietnam and work with a school uh, on a safety system. And I mean, we're not talking just a little school. We're talking a school with 4,000 children. Okay, and we're talking about children's lives. So it's a very serious thing. Uh, and so we put a lot of things in place. Was actually probably one of the most enjoyable things I've ever done in my life. And trust me, being around 4,000 kids was never my idea of enjoyment, but it was actually a lot of fun. Uh, But the really cool thing that happened out of that was that was put in place by December of 2019 and was really starting to roll by January of 2020. And it hit just in time for the pandemic. And it was not by any great insight on my part. I don't know. It may have been for the CEO. She was very, very smart, very progressive. I don't know that she maybe saw a pandemic coming, but she certainly, when you got 4,000 children, obviously their health is a forethought. But because she put that thing in place at the time she did, they didn't have the problem with the pandemic that everybody did. Last I heard, they never lost a single student. And they had over 1,000 teachers as well. And I don't believe they lost any teachers either. So, that would be one of those things. If you see that kind of thing, you see that risk coming, and putting something in place that says, I'm going to put a system in place that says, this is what I'm going to do if this happens. It's very normal, if I'm on the coast, to say, okay, well, I want to have a system in place that tells me when I've got tsunamis coming, this is what I do for a tsunami. Okay, people understand that kind of risk management. That's normal. Okay, what about the stuff that's happening that's not normal? Okay, who's looking out? I want you to look outside the box. Okay, but then there's always somebody in the crowd that goes, well, we want you to think outside the box. Nobody can really tell you how to think outside the box. So, you've got to figure out what is not inside your box. Tsunamis are inside your box. Volcanoes, if you live on an island, it's got a volcano, that's on your box, inside your box. Okay, but what's outside? You got to have a view for that. Just look at something, I don't know, let's get really weird. Okay, the height, if we look at centrifugal effect, okay, they say the height of the ocean at the equator is higher than it is at the poles. What happens if the world slows down?
You got to repeat that again for me.
Okay, the world's spinning, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so you got centrifugal effect. So at the equator, okay, they say that the height of the ocean is higher than it is at the poles. Okay, and I wouldn't really build a strategic plan around this, but how fast does the spinning of the globe or the earth have to slow down before some of that water starts to settle down and the level of the ocean increases? We talk about the melting of ice caps all the time. What about the speed of rotation? Like I say, that's probably a little far-fetched. I'm not sure I'd build a big strategic plan around it. But if it's truly higher, we know it's higher on the West Coast than it is on the East Coast. Okay, so all this is a function of the speed of the Earth spinning. What happens if it slows down? So, those are risks that you want to take a look at. Again, you look at, when you're on the Gulf Coast of Texas down here, you better have plans to deal with hurricanes. They're just a fact of life, right? That's part of your risk assessment. So what makes it worse? What makes it better? And if you work with the oil companies, you watch what goes on, in terms of predicting the path of a hurricane, and realistically, you watch the news and nobody really seems to know where it goes. You don't believe that oil companies that have platforms out in the ocean don't have a better idea. They got more science. They know, they can tell you where that hurricane is going. They don't get caught flat-footed very often because that is a real risk for them. When a hurricane comes, you pull pipe. Okay, if you're on a deep water rig and you're drilling in 8,000 feet of water, you're going to pull 8,000 feet of pipe, rack it off, and you're going to cut that platform loose to just go float around in in the Gulf, okay, until the hurricane's gone. Then you got to go find a platform, put it back in place, and put the pipe back down. You want to know, you don't want to go pull that much pipe just because you aren't really sure where the hurricane's going to go, right? Mm-hmm. Part of how you manage that risk is by getting better at predicting the path of hurricanes. So, you look at this, and I mean, you got to pay attention to your industry, you got to pay attention to your risk, and you got to understand those things that, represent risk to you. I mean, if I'm in the middle of the Caribbean, I'm not worried about drought. I don't have a water problem. I've got a salt problem, but I don't have a water problem. Okay. So, yeah, I mean, you look at that, you take care of the risk that actually represents a problem for you. So, and we don't want to, if we kind of back up a little bit, dystopia, it's not really practical in terms of a strategy, but it represents a threat. And so your strategy needs to be building something to deal with those things that represent risk to you, because that risk can become dystopian to your particular industry.
Irrespective of the industry, isn't it? Irrespective of the industry, whether it is leisure or to any extent to the high tech.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh,
there we go.
That was a great session and excellent. So you have, again, we are talking in terms of time. So what I heard you saying is we define disruption, we define, this I'm going to get the pronunciation right. We define dystopia. And we said that keep your eyeballs focused on the gap and treat different types of disruptions, and the dystopia treat it as a threat, but ensure that you have proper risk management in place. And we said some of them may be unexpected, some of them can be expected, but then focus, focus, and focus. That's what I heard you saying. Am I right to that extent, to summarize what you said?
Exactly. I mean, like I'm saying, the real focus, there's a lot of people want to focus on technology and that, but they're, if you're going to survive, it's a gap that's representing opportunity and risk, and how well you deal with what's going on in that gap. That's where your future is, and that gap is your survival.
Great. So we covered the first part, where we define cadence. We saw you built up the laws. Then we saw the gap. Now we discussed the gap. We built into that disruption. We built into that what I love to pronounce now, dystopia. And then we thought about the threat, the strategies, etc. And the part 3 of it, we're not going to tell them anything unless we start speaking about the part 3. So see you across, and when we talk about the part 3. Thank you very much, Mike. It was very entertaining, very informative, and I love learning a lot. And thank you very much, and see you in part 3.
Sounds good. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.